We want to move on to our final discussion here, and we want to turn to what's been happening in Iran, where, of course, President Putin, President Erdogan of Turkey, and the Iranian leadership have all been meeting around ostensibly just the Astana process and the war in Syria, but there are many more things that seem to be going on around that affect geopolitics. Very honored to be joined here by Brian Becker, who's the host of the Socialist program and also the national director of the Answer Coalition. Brian Becker, thank you so much for being back with us.
My pleasure.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. I think you have the highest rated show on Breakthrough News, so we're honored to have you here. But
are we competing? Wait.
No, go ahead.
Oh no, I was waiting for you.
Oh no, I thought you had it.
Going to Iran. So.
Yeah. Well, yes.
Well, let's talk about your show.
A lot happening in Iran, of course. I mean, there's sort of the broader issue of that it's actually kind of faded. The reason that all these people were gathering in Iran, the Astana process. So, I mean, that is a factor. But I think just generally the way a lot of people have seen this, and I'm curious your thoughts about this, Brian, is this in many ways is sort of a rebuke following so quickly on the heels of Biden's trip to the Middle East, which was so heavily centered around trying to mitigate the impacts of the U.S. sanctions on Russia. And, you know, here is Putin sort of at the center of the world stage. You've got a NATO country's president there. You've got Iran signing big deals with Russia. That it really just was a sign that this attempt to isolate Russia as a consequence of their invasion of Ukraine is really just not working.
Right. I think we'd have to say that Biden's trip was pretty much a colossal failure and a clear indicator of the diminished position of the United States in the Middle East and perhaps globally. I mean, I try to avoid those kind of formulations. I think sometimes people are hyperbolic about empire in decline and it's the last days of U.S. imperialism. I don't think that at all. But I do think that if you compare Biden's trip, where the Saudis, a principal ally of the United States, who are now expanding their communications actually with Iran and also with Russia, they're just buying huge amounts of Russian fuel in spite of all of the sanctions in the attempt by the U.S. to evict Russia from the world economy. And Biden, who said he wasn't going to meet with MBS, he wasn't going to meet with the Crown Prince because of the killing and dismemberment of a Washington Post journalist, I mean, was like such a big story. And yet the Saudis didn't even meet Biden at the airport. They didn't provide the same protocols as they did for the other leaders. And then Biden gets out and does that like famous fist bump with MBS. It really showed how diminished the U.S. was. I mean, just think back to when MBS came and met with Trump. Trump made his first visit overseas was to the Saudis. He was sitting there, in the words of Mohammed Marandi, our friend, like an obedient son to Donald Trump, while Trump embarrassed him by showing him the picture of all the weapons the United States was going to sell the Saudis. So here, Biden is failing, and Putin makes his first overseas trip since February 24th, since the so-called special military operation. That's what the Russians call the invasion of Ukraine. Everybody else calls it the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But this is the first visit, and it was very significant because Erdogan was also there. And yes, it's the Astana talks, meaning these were the big three in terms of Syria peace negotiations in the past. But Turkey is also the eastern flanco, and it's a very big military and a very important part of NATO. And so to go to Iran, a country that the United States tried to make a pariah state for a long time, Donald Trump ripped up the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear arms deal, said it was the worst deal ever, and then he bullied all the European nations who wanted the deal. He bullied them to capitulate, and they did. And here you have Iran is coming out of its economic depression. There's a lot of trade going on now with Iran. The worst days of the extreme sanctions are lifting because the world is changing. And yeah, they came together, and I think Erdogan's got a lot of problems at home. He needs Iran. He needs Russia for his own opportunistic reasons. But we see a reconstellation. In the words of that great geostrategic thinker, Bob Dylan, The times they are a-changing. And you could see it as evidenced by Putin's visit to Tehran. And by the way, there was a $40 billion deal signed between Gazprom, the Russian national oil company, and the Iranians. This means that the eviction of Iran and Russia from the world economy has brought them together, and they're actually not going down. They're stable. Biden said he was going to make the Russian ruble into rubble. Well, no, that hasn't happened. So all of this boasting, this chest thumping, it's been disproved by a number of things, but I think the visit by Putin to Iran is certainly one of them.
Mm-hmm. Shout out to Christopher Cotton, by the way, for your donation. Don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows.
Thank you, Christopher Cotton. I think it's interesting too but on Wednesday, so after this meeting on Wednesday, the Pentagon, Lloyd Austin, during a press conference explicitly responded to a question about Iran potentially selling Russia its drones, warning Iran not to do that. It would be a bad idea. So that was interesting. Is just the U.S. definitely seems a little bit rattled by this. And I also think the Turkey element is interesting because, Turkey is always seen as this reactionary country, which it is, that aligns with the West sometimes, which it is, but it's also a very self-interested country, which is why Turkey can go from being a part of NATO to then also making these very self-interested, opportunistic deals and having these meetings with the Russians and the Iranians. There's a pretty good relationship between Turkey and Iran. But just to what you were saying, another geostrategic thinker, not as well known as Bob Dylan, Zbigniew Brzezinski actually said, this is from one of his books, the most dangerous scenario for America would be a grand coalition of China, Russia, and perhaps Iran, an anti-hegemonic coalition united not by ideology, but by complementary grievances. And this, of course, this isn't from any time recently. This is an older book from, I think, maybe even the 80s. Yeah, the Devil's Chessboard. I think I don't even remember when that was, or I don't even know the published date of that. But that was a warning from a long time ago. And now, we kind of are witnessing that come to fruition, Brian, are we not?
Indeed. Brzezinski is correct about that, even though he was anticipating it, decades ago. And it's really important for us, those who are against imperialism, against colonialism or neocolonialism, those who are looking for a better world, to recognize that the opposition to U.S. hegemony isn't based on countries having an ideological worldview about a better world. They really are being brought together by their sort of concurrent grievances that have been imposed on them by the U.S. dominated world economy and, of course, U.S. dominated military affairs. So Turkey and Iran and Russia, it's not like the socialist camp during the Soviet era or during the 50s and the early 60s, where there was an ideological component, and in the competition between capitalism and socialism had an element of struggle between states and states with their own agendas, but there was an ideological element to it. This is not an ideological opposition to U.S. hegemony. It's based on mutual grievances. And those grievances, in turn, are caused by the arrogance and the hubris of the United States that feels that they can dictate to the rest of the world, including major countries. Iran is a major country. Turkey is a major country. Whether you like Erdogan or not, and we certainly are no fans of Erdogan, Turkey is a big country and an important country. So is Russia. And now you see that Iran is trying to become part of BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, China, India, South Africa, major emerging countries that are brought together not because they're communists or socialists or have a grand ideological position, but they want to grow, they want to develop, they want to overcome poverty, they want to overcome the legacy of imposed underdevelopment based on colonialism or neocolonialism. And as America becomes so arrogant and so dominating, they have to find each other. Now Iran, by the way, is also moved from observer status to non-voting status in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So we see all of these north-south corridors, Belt and Road Initiative, Shanghai Communication Organization, BRICS, which I thought after the coup that overthrew Dilma Rousseff in Brazil and Bolsonaro taking over, I would have thought, well, yeah, Bolsonaro, the fascist, pro-American, Hitler-admiring leader of Brazil would, sort of leave BRICS, but they're not. And so we have this phenomena where these countries are being brought together. They have something in common with each other, which is that they don't want to be treated as like slaves. They don't want to be treated as if this is the 19th century rather than the 21st century. And that's really important because this is innate in human beings. Human beings want to be self-determining. Individuals want to be self-determining. Peoples want to be self-determining. Countries want to be self-determining. And that's what we see happening.
No, I think that's an extraordinarily important point, and it's an interesting mix in a way. The sort of people who've been brought together. You mentioned Bolsonaro, now he's bringing in diesel fuel from Russia, and of course, you already mentioned Saudi Arabia buying fuel from Russia for the domestic consumption that they could sell more to Europe and make a lot of money. I mean, it's really interesting to see the way the world is shifting on so many different axes and so dynamically on so many different fronts. And one of the things that I think is interesting, and I'm glad, Rhonda, you raised this issue of the Brzezinski quote and the issue of Russia, China, and Iran coming together, and what we're seeing with BRICS and the SCO and cooperation on multiple different levels. Is it just feels that in the wake of seeing the U.S. House of Representatives pass its $839 billion war budget last week, and of course it's now being reconciled with the Senate, their budget is actually bigger. I think it's like 840-some billion, so it's going to be this huge budget, over $8 trillion in 10 years. It just makes that feel even more futile, Brian, in a way. I mean, it's like, we're being told, well, you have to have this because all these countries are trying to do something terrible to the United States. But it's just to double down on the policies that got the United States in such a blind cul-de-sac in the first place. And I don't know where I'm going with this, but it just putting what you said in context of seeing how they're just doubling down on these failed policies just seems like such a disaster for the people, well, maybe not the rich people, but certainly for the working class people here in the United States.
Yeah, and I'm sure the two of you noticed that when Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, the U.S. kind of united Europe under its banner. So all of the people who were skeptics about NATO, they were kind of shut up. They were afraid to come out, or maybe they were, whatever. The U.S. sort of took over Europe fully. And you could see this sense of euphoria within the U.S. establishment. You could feel it in the media and from government politicians, like this new sort of world confrontation was going to save America. It was going to bring America back. Like as if the Cold War, this tortured reading of the Cold War, where it gave America and its allies this common cause, and it led to the space race, which led to new computers, and all of these sort of collateral advantages that the United States gleaned from having a common purpose, a common enemy. And so for a couple months, that elation was there, but now you see it sort of unraveling, because the reality is that the U.S. spending $800 billion or $900 billion or $1 trillion, whatever the real number is, and we don't really know the real number, it's probably more than $1 trillion, to build more weapons and more instruments of death and destruction, and to stockpile them and put them into Europe and put them right on Russia's border. Like, does it solve any problem for Americans? Does it solve the problem of gridlock in Congress, where Congress can't do a damn thing except investigate itself? I mean, endless investigations. When the Democrats were in, they had 4 years of investigations over Russiagate, and now the next 4 years were investigation of Trump, and all they do is investigate each other. Meanwhile, the bridges are crumbling. There are 70,000 bridges, according to the engineering group, that need repair. The U.S. hasn't built one high-speed train. You have COVID, where 1 million people died, and everybody's just like, it's cool. It's all normal, like whatever. You have growing poverty, and then this evisceration of rights, the things that people thought really made America better, like civil rights, like abortion rights, women's rights, gay rights, like the things that were better, those are being taken away. The right wing of the ruling class, by these unelected little dictators who wear lawyerly robes in the Supreme Court, just eviscerating people's rights. How does a war with Russia help women in America? How does it help gay people? How does it help poor people? It doesn't help at all. So this notion that the new Cold War will be good for America and overcome its slow slog down is absolutely false. And I think the emperor, in fact, has no clothes, and this is going to become more and more evident.
Brian, that's such an important point to make. And then you look at Europe and what you were saying about Europe and how the Americans were so excited because, Europe is finally ours again. There's no more tug of war. But you look at Europe now and yes, you're right. The war in Russia, the war against Russia, the war in Ukraine, it doesn't help Americans. But it also doesn't, except for maybe the inflation we're experiencing all around the world. Americans don't feel it the way that the Europeans do because geographically speaking, the Europeans are close to Russia. Also, what's so stunning to me is to see these European leaders complaining and whining. Russia's blackmailing us. They're using energy as a weapon. And, I'll be generous to the Europeans. Let's say Russia is using gas as a weapon. What did you think was going to happen when you sanction your biggest gas supplier and then pour weapons into a country with which it's at war? The European mentality here is incredible to me. They are actually slitting their own throats for U.S. empire, and it doesn't even help them. They're getting nothing out of it except the destruction of their own industries. You see the head of the unions in Germany warning that our industries are close to collapsing if the lack of fuel continues and the lack of these commodities from Russia continues. You see also Europe is stuck in this heat wave, unable to provide air conditioning for people, and then also warning about gas rationing come wintertime. We're just ranting here, but what are the Europeans thinking? It's incredible. I can't really wrap my head around it.
No, it's mind-boggling, actually. It's mind-boggling. Europe is on fire right now. The south of France, Portugal, big parts of the continent are on fire. Inflation is going, the ruble wasn't made into rubble, but the euro kind of really sunk. And now inflation is really taking off. Russia, by the way, Putin just, I think earlier today or maybe last night, announced that they're going to have a full resume of gas supplies for Europe in the coming months, and the futures prices dropped on gas, so that provides Europeans some relief. That was Putin doing this thing to help Europe. You're right, Rania. It's like they see the edge of the cliff. The European capitalists, who are the water boys for American imperialism, they see the edge of the cliff and they say, "Let's get together and charge. Go right for it, attack." And that way we'll be in the good graces of Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Wall Street bankers. That's your payoff. This is so, but look what happened with the Iran, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Iran agrees to be completely monitored by the West, completely intrusive inspections, so that they'll prove to themselves that they don't have a nuclear weapon. They won't be able to get one for at least 15 years. Not that Iran wants a nuclear weapon. All the countries agreed to it. And they can start to trade with Iran and lower their gas bill and their gas prices in Europe. And Trump comes in and says, this is the worst deal ever, rips it up. And these clowns in Europe, the European capitalists, these supplicants, genuflecting before the altar of the White House, who's ever in it, they say, we want the deal, but they don't stand up to America because Trump said, look, we'll sanction you too, Germany. We'll sanction France. They're all like, okay, then we're going to get on our knees. Same with the boycott and blockade of Cuba. These capitalists in Europe, they don't deserve to run countries because they are like the water boys for U.S. imperialism, and it's hurting Europeans. And it's bringing Europe closer not only to economic distress, but possibly a new war. Hasn't Europe had enough of wars? Why listen to Washington? America is the only country that goes to war but exempts its own people from the cruelties of war because it's always on somebody else's soil.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway,
No,
I'm
I
gonna
think
rant
that's
with
such a very good point. And, you know, one thing I just want to highlight here, we're slightly pivoting, but we've got you here, so I'm going to lay it out. You had an excellent episode talking about war and other people's territory. You had an excellent episode of the Socialist program with Dr. Ken Hammond about the issue of Taiwan. But, you know, Nancy Pelosi announcing she wants to take this trip to Taiwan, which just seems, with everything going on, an unbelievable, just, you know, pouring gas on the fire kind of situation. But I mean, just give us some sense of the implications of that, because I think, you know, time and again, I think many Americans don't really understand what the big deal is with Taiwan, but it's, you know, very, very key in terms of the broader position in Asia, because of how deeply felt it is for people on the Chinese mainland, this issue of potential reunification. And it just seems Pelosi is talk about pushing things over a cliff with this trip.
Yeah. I mean, Taiwan was part of China for 350 years, minimally, right? And you could really go a lot further back. Japanese colonialism stole Taiwan in 1895 and made it part of the Japanese Empire. When Japan was defeated at the end of World War II, Taiwan came back to China, which it's part of China. It's been part of China longer than the United States has existed by double. And so the Chinese reestablished relations with the U.S. when Richard Nixon and Kissinger went there in 1972. And the Chinese, Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, they said to Nixon, who had his own, you know, reasons for trying to break up the alliance between the Soviet Union and China. That's why they went there and wanted to have normal relations. The Chinese said there's one condition for the normalization of relations. You acknowledge that Taiwan is part of China. And Nixon signed the agreement. It's a bilateral agreement. The Shanghai Communique was signed in February 1972. That's 50 years ago. It was reaffirmed in 1979 when Deng Xiaoping met with Carter. It was reaffirmed again in the 1980s. It is the bedrock, or what the Chinese call the guardrails for U.S.-China relations. Nancy Pelosi, the number 3 politician in the line of succession, president, vice president, speaker of the House, to go to Taiwan, a part of China, and treat it as an independent state, while Biden is the president, meaning it could only happen with Biden's blessing and Anthony Blinken's blessings. It's viewed by China, and this is what the Chinese call it, a strategic level provocation. And the defense minister of China, who is also a state counselor, said, "We are prepared to fight till the end if anyone tries to change the status of Taiwan." Can you be any more blatant? So why is Nancy Pelosi, I mean, the Democrats are about to get crushed in the midterm elections, but what is she doing? Let's go start a war with China over Taiwan. I mean, these people are so addicted to the military-industrial complex and so addicted to war in general, and I'm talking about the Democrats and Republicans, that this is what they think is really popular in America. And again, if you took a poll of the American people and said, anybody want to have a military clash with China over the status of Taiwan, I think the number of people, well, how many members are there in Congress? That's the number of people who would vote yes. The 435 members of the House of Representatives. Nobody else in America would think this is a good idea. But Nancy Pelosi's trip, if she does it, if the Chinese are calling it a strategic level provocation, that means they're going to respond. Both sides start to climb the escalation ladder. That's how wars start.
Mm-hmm. Well, Brian, we really appreciate you, as always, joining us here in the program. I really do hope people check out this week's Socialist program, all of them, of course, but really great primer there with Dr. Ken Hammond. But
well,
as always, Brian Becker, thank you so much for giving you want to get in?
I was going to say the Freedom Side is my favorite show on Breakthrough News. I just want to make that crystal clear to all.
Perfect. Well, the Socialist program is ours. So as you can see, we both are great admirers of each other's work. So if you're watching, that means whatever you do, make sure you share the Socialist program and the Freedom Side every single week with everyone who's following you. But Brian, thanks so much for giving us some of your time.
Good talking.